Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, March 24th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about President Trump's impact on the 2022 Senate elections and how he could actually lose certain races for the GOP. Looking at our 2022 Senate map, the Republican Party is looking at certain states to pick up in order to win back Senate control. Currently, the composition is 50 Democrats to 50 Republicans, which means the GOP only needs one Democratic seat in order to win back Senate control. But the problem is, even if they're able to pick up one seat, they could potentially lose another down the race. Sorry, down the road. My voice is clearer now, isn't it? But looking at our Senate map, the GOP is going to have some trouble here with Donald Trump holding a lot of weight on some of these potential primaries. The must-retain states go pretty far because they are states that the GOP cannot afford to lose. The GOP is here about focusing on winning states like Arizona and Nevada and Georgia and New Hampshire, promising to their constituents and to the party leadership that they will be able to follow through with such victories. But the problem is, if the Republican Party does pick up those seats, what's stopping the Democratic Party from making gains in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida if the Republican Party is completely on the offense? On top of that, there's nothing stopping Democrats from retaining these seats. Just because it's supposed to be a red wave year doesn't mean it'll actually be one. And that brings my attention to must-maintain states. I've talked about Donald Trump's negative impact on potential victories and how that could backfire on pickups that might be easier if Donald Trump was not in the midst. But what we could see here is that Donald Trump not only doesn't help them win states currently held by Democrats, but actually loses states that are in this must-maintain column. So these are just competitive states. Obviously, every single Republican race must be maintained. But these are in states that are historically competitive that the GOP needs to ensure that they are able to hold on to. Well, as of right now, Chuck Grassley doesn't look as if he has plans to retire, at least in the immediate. Right now, I'm not going to assume for the sake of this video, because I would normally say, Chuck Grassley, I expect him to retire, but I'm not going to talk about Trump's impact in this state, and I also don't think it's applicable. I think there are certain states where Trump has a negative impact and certain states where he might have a beneficial one, and Iowa might actually be one of those states where it's beneficial. Same thing with the state of Ohio. So I'm not going to talk about either of those two states, but we're not going to be working under the assumption that Chuck Grassley is retiring in this video, but it really wouldn't make a difference. And then looking down into Florida, I'm going to characterize this one as a Republican state, and that leaves me with 3 Senate races. 3 in particular that, if the Democratic Party wins, will be an exact opposite of what happened in 2016. In the 2016 Senate election results, we saw the Democratic Party get 48 seats and the Republicans at 52. Not exactly opposite, exact opposite of 2018, which was 4 years ago. I don't know why I thought 2016 was 4 years ago. But looking at 2018 was 3 years ago. But, you get my point, right? 4 years ago from 2022. And looking at the Senate numbers here, the Democratic Party would be ecstatic with these numbers. They would be so happy to see a 53 Senate majority for the Democrats, but it isn't really feasible unless Donald Trump and the Republican Party screw up in some of these must-maintain states, specifically in Wisconsin, Michigan. Sorry, not Wisconsin. No, not Michigan. Yes, Wisconsin. I don't know what just happened right there. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, I'm used to saying them all 3 together, and North Carolina. So with these states in particular, I'm going to go ahead and put them back in the yellow colorization here. What this means is that Donald Trump in these states is going to try to put a lot of weight on the primary races here, most specifically in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Now, you might be asking why. Why does Donald Trump want to hold some type of presence in these states? Well, first things first, both Pennsylvania and North Carolina have retiring Republican incumbents. That means the GOP doesn't have anyone that's the incumbent that's going to be running, which means there won't be that factor benefiting the GOP. The Republican Party will not have this little 1-2 point boost in their favor. Sometimes it gets as large as 10, 15 points in other states. But in North Carolina, this boost was only around 2 points more than what Donald Trump had won by on the presidential level, and that has now been removed. There is no incumbent boost. The incumbent party might have a subtle increase, but it's still an open race. It's anyone's race to win. There is no status quo in this situation because the incumbent is retiring. You can't even put full faith in the incumbent political party to not change up the lives of North Carolina citizens in the United States Senate. Keep in mind, congressional members rarely ever have a direct impact on the lives of their constituents in most cases, but that's just how it's going to be considered in the eyes of many voters. So in North Carolina in particular, with Richard Burr retiring, I can promise you Donald Trump is going to try to do everything he can in order to have weight on this race. The reason for that is because Richard Burr is a Republican retiring incumbent who has been very much a staunch conservative and very much a big proponent of President Trump, who voted to convict him. Now, the reason why he voted to convict him was because he thought he was guilty, but the second reason was that he's retiring. He has no electorate to please anymore. He won't be denied by the voters because he's leaving on his own terms. So in order to get back at Richard Burr here, or the GOP, like Mitch McConnell and other top GOP figureheads, what we'll see here is that Donald Trump is going to try to hold some impact on this race. And what we're actually starting to see now is that Laura Trump is potentially running for this Senate race, to a point where even we see another senator, Lindsey Graham, endorsing Laura Trump for Senate here in North Carolina, and she's polling pretty well, even against Pat McCrory, who's a well-known name across the state. Mark Walker, who's the only person who is announced so far. She could very well run, and if she does end up running, I think that she would have an okay chance at victory in the general election. But the thing is, when I say okay, that doesn't mean it's super secure. President Trump didn't exactly win in North Carolina by a super deafening margin. It's comparable to Pennsylvania in terms of the margin, 1.3%. That's not large. Relative to 2016, Donald Trump won this state by 3.4%. So this is actually a pretty dramatic decrease. 2 years later, it could decrease by 1 to 2 points in favor of the Democratic Party. And when you look at the race here in North Carolina, we saw record-breaking turnout amongst rural counties, but a shift amongst the white college-educated voting groups in this state. What you saw is that there was higher turnout amongst minorities. Higher turnout amongst minorities, even if narrowly shifting in favor of Donald Trump, will mean the Democratic Party does actually gain votes because they're actually voting in a higher level, right? And looking at the surrounding rural counties, what you notice is that the rural counties shifted to the right and the urban counties shifted to the left. And I guess that sort of makes sense, but also, just looking at the results here, Donald Trump was able to drive up rural turnout and, counteract the increase in support in the urban areas and the suburban areas, enough to win the state by 1.3%, but not enough to be secure. And if there is not a Republican who can tap into this base ahead of 2022, and keep in mind that the state is growing, which means it's growing in terms of more and more minority voters in the state, 2022 will be a more difficult type of electorate. And, looking at President Trump's approval rating on Election Day versus his final day in office, let's look. So around Election Day, he had a 45% approval rating nationwide, 53% disapproval rating, a difference of 8 points. When he left office, he left with a difference of 19 points, a huge difference in terms of those who approve and those who disapprove. Donald Trump doubled the amount of people who disapproved of him, doubled the margin in terms of the approve versus disapprove. He made himself even more unlikable than on Election Day, and he was rejected by voters on Election Day. So with Donald Trump holding a heavy impact on this race, especially with someone with his last name on the ballot, I don't think that the Democratic Party should be super worried. Yes, I do think that Donald Trump will be able to land certain candidates into primary victories, but I think he will cross them over the finish line in swing states? Absolutely not. President Trump has been rejected by voters. Looking at North Carolina's approval rating of Donald Trump, we can actually go and take a look. According to Civics right now, it looks in North Carolina that Donald Trump has a negative 9% approval rating amongst the constituents here. If you take a look at that change over time, it's never really been in the positive, which is why, Democrats were able to perform so well in 2018 and nearly win the Senate race here and the presidential election in 2020. It wasn't good enough. But just looking at his approval rating on Election Day, let's find it here. 1103, right? His approval rating here was 46% to a 52% disapproval rating, which means there's a difference closer than the national margin, but a difference of 6 points. Once he was leaving office, it was a difference of 9 points. That's enough to sway 1 to 2% of voters. I don't think the Republican Party should be super secure in this race. But I think out of all of them, North Carolina is the likeliest to go to the GOP, which is why I'm going to put it in the narrowest Democratic victory column as of right now, just for the sake of the characterization. But the next state I think that could be the closest one out of them, or not the closest, the second most likely to go to the Democratic Party, is the state of Wisconsin. And the reason why I say that is because Ron Johnson, as the Republican incumbent, hasn't really announced whether or not he's going to run. I am not too certain about whether or not he is going to run for re-election here. I think if he runs, it makes it more difficult for the Democrats. But even if he doesn't, then I think the Democratic Party will become the favorites in this race. But looking at Ron Johnson's record, he is the Wisconsin Senate version of Donald Trump. Maybe not nearly as outspoken or as charismatic, but holds very similar views, and in terms of the votes that matter, ultimately sides with President Trump a lot of the time. For someone who comes from a purple state, he's very solid red in terms of his voting history, and is very proud about that. He came into the Capitol insurrection the day of it, before they had actually stormed the Capitol, with every intention to vote against the certification of certain states in Congress. Voted to object to the electoral certification. Ended up changing his mind after the Capitol insurrection, but his intentions were clear. Networks had already released their stories about the senators that were backing this baseless claims of election fraud. For someone who comes from a state that was supposedly part of the election fraud scheme, supposedly a part of this multi-level takedown of President Trump, he is someone who fed into this conspiracy and essentially told his own voters here in Wisconsin that you didn't flip the state. Joe Biden and the Democrats were able to through voter fraud. Now, how do you think that rubs off? Right? You voted for Ron Johnson in 2016. Donald Trump was the first Republican you voted for in decades. Donald Trump wins the election. You're happy he won. You voted for him. Then comes around 2020. You've been hit hard by COVID-19. You think Donald Trump could have done more in order to solve the problem. Whatever it might be, you end up voting for Joe Biden. Well, there you have the senator that you reelected back in 2016 telling you that your vote was rigged. Telling the people that Trump won in a landslide. That Wisconsin wasn't even close. Trump won by a lot and that it was rigged. Well, how do you think you feel? You're one of those swing voters who's open-minded, who's an independent, and now you're at a crossroads between choosing whether or not you're going to support Ron Johnson again after he told you that your vote was fraudulent, after he had said that the state was tampered with, that the election was wrong, that the person you backed cheated to get there. You're not going to have a positive reception to that. No one will. No one that backed Joe Biden is going to say, absolutely, it was rigged, right? So looking at Wisconsin, the problem here is that Ron Johnson doesn't represent historically a red state like North Carolina, a red state at all. Looking at the state's 2020 election results, it's not even as if it had gone to Donald Trump. Joe Biden won the state of Wisconsin. I see no reason as to why he's been fully fledged in terms of his support for President Trump, other than the fact I think he's going to try to replicate what Donald Trump did in 2016 and what he was able to do in Wisconsin. But here's the thing. Yes, Ron Johnson outperformed Donald Trump, but the times are different. This was before he tried to replicate Donald Trump. He was able to do better than him because he won over more crossover support than Donald Trump. But now that he's trying to be the next Donald Trump, now that he's going to completely run through with his endorsement and use it as a means of winning, it's not going to work. Voters are more optimistic about Trump in 2016 than they were in 2020, which is why Trump was able to win in 2016 and why he lost in 2020. Looking at 2022, I think that Wisconsin will be the next state out of the three to go to the Democratic Party simply because, looking at the state's electoral history, Republicans have not had a super strong advantage here. Outside of gerrymandered state Senate seats and outside of a few governor blips, the last time a Republican had won Wisconsin before Donald Trump was in 1984 with Ronald Reagan's landslide victory where he won 49 states. Donald Trump was an anomaly. And while Ron Johnson has gotten lucky, winning in 2 red wave years, 2010 was when he was first elected, 2016 was when he was reelected. 2022 might not be that red wave year. With COVID-19 harming the state and with the Rust Belt getting bluer relative to 2016, and looking at the 2018 Senate results in Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin won by double digits. I would not be super secure if I was Ron Johnson. And Donald Trump in this state isn't exactly someone who's adored. Let's take a look. Let's go back to the national numbers. Let's go ahead and visit Wisconsin. Well, what you notice here is that his approval rating is at -13. On election day, Donald Trump was around -8. -8 versus -13 is a huge difference. It's nearly the numbers on the national level. Looking at Wisconsin, I wouldn't be too secure if I was a member of the Republican Party. Rather than looking over Wisconsin, focusing on Arizona, they should focus a lot of their money on Wisconsin, especially if Ron Johnson doesn't decide to run. Looking at the numbers here, I think that the Democratic Party should be okay with their chances here. I think they should be complacent with where they are currently. Obviously, work harder to make it more competitive. Republicans should do the same thing to make it more solid for the GOP. But I don't think the Democrats are going to look at this race and say, we're not going to win it. especially if Donald Trump tries to hold some presence in this state, which I can tell you, even if it's an open race or it's not, he's going to try to hold some weight in the state of Wisconsin because he is the first Republican to win it in quite some time, but he lost it. The voters rejected him a second time. They said, we're not giving you a second chance. We're not giving you another term. So I can understand why the GOP might be quick to say, let's replicate what Trump did in 2016. But the fact is, if he tries to campaign on behalf of them in 2022, he's going to replicate what happened in 2020, which was the fact that voters were turned off by President Trump and consequently voted against him. And the final state, the state that I think is the likeliest to go to the Democratic Party, is the state of Pennsylvania. Now, I also think Donald Trump is going to try to hold some heavy presence in the state of Pennsylvania. Pat Toomey is another Republican who voted to convict President Trump. He has been a very big critic of President Trump in the past, and while he did campaign on the same ballot as him in 2016, he wasn't exactly, fully fledged in his support, at least recently. And looking at the candidate list on the Democratic side, I think the Democratic Party has a pretty strong list of people who could end up running. Connor Lamb, John Fetterman. Looking at the list here, we could see some names that are known amongst the state that could potentially run up the numbers here. And I think just looking at the Republican list, so far, we don't know exactly who's going to be the Republican front runner. We don't know who's going to run. Obviously, Pat Toomey as the incumbent is not running. Lou Barletta was the candidate back in 2018. He ended up losing by a very large margin. And looking at the potential list, I think there certainly will be some top names that decide to run. But I don't think many of them are going to hold too much weight, at least relative to the Democratic top candidates here. And I think Donald Trump Jr. as a potential name is honestly very interesting. I think that this is going to be potentially 2022, a year where Trump's family members and Trump's closest allies end up in the Republican Party nomination process and end up winning those primaries and then end up losing in the general election. And that's what I could see happening here in 2022. Donald Trump has been very big about his presence in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the Rust Belt region, because yes, he is the Republican that has won here for the first time in the 21st century, for the first time since 1988. But that doesn't change the fact that voters didn't want him for a second term. With Donald Trump sending out all these statements through his Save America PAC, he will have a dramatic effect on the primary process here. But these states, these three states in particular, the GOP must retain if they want any chance at winning back control of the majority. I think Donald Trump's presence here will actually harm the GOP's chances. There are certain states where Donald Trump might help. Those states are right now safe Republican states and Iowa, Ohio, and Florida. I think Donald Trump's presence in these states will help the GOP. But looking at Wisconsin and looking at Pennsylvania and North Carolina with a growing minority population, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin moving away from Donald Trump in 2020, as did North Carolina, but these actually flipped. I can't imagine these states would be too inclined to back a Trump-like candidate when they didn't even want him back in 2020. Now, 2022 will be very much a turnout game, but the Democratic Party has been able to make off years without Trump on the ballot, even if he's in office or not. For example, the 2021 runoff elections, to be very much anti-Trump, to be very much, moving against this rhetoric from Trump and these claims, these statements made by President Trump that the Democratic Party calls hateful, that the Democratic Party calls insightful. And I think if he does maintain a heavy presence, which he has pretty much promised to do, I mean, looking at the CPAC, statements made by top Democrats, they say Donald Trump ain't going anywhere. This is strange to see that the Republican Party is so reluctant to give up a failed candidate. And, that will be their own demise. Because I think they're looking at 2020 and saying, we picked up seats in the House. We nearly, held control of the Senate. And we were able to flip a number of state legislatures, but keep the presidential margin close. But honestly speaking, why would the GOP want to hold, the same type of candidate and campaign style that lost in 2020? It really doesn't make sense to me, but to each their own. And looking at these three Senate races in particular, I think Donald Trump will help in others and hurt in some. And these are the some that he will hurt: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. I can guarantee you Donald Trump will be invited for campaign rallies here. He will hold them. He will have in-person rallies. He will hold fundraisers, and he will send his Save America PAC money to these states. But the problem is, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania don't want Donald Trump. North Carolina, Donald Trump didn't exactly expand his margin here in 2020 relative to 2016. So looking at Trump's previous performance in these states and the Democratic Party's performance in 2018, I think Trump simply bringing his presence here will be detrimental to the GOP, and they need to recognize that. Trump has some strengths. He can do better for the Democrats in Florida and Iowa and Ohio. But he probably won't in these 3 states. 2 of them voted against him. The other 3 that I mentioned, Ohio, Iowa, and Florida, did not. It would make sense he would want to go there because he did make the states more Republican relative to Mitt Romney, John McCain, even George W. Bush in 2000. But just looking at the margins in the other states, I don't think that the Republican Party should be too inclined to work with Donald Trump in these states. But I can guarantee you, because Donald Trump has this prominence and because he holds a lot of electoral weight, that he will use that to his advantage. The same way he utilized a bully pulpit method that many presidents have had used in the past to push for key pieces of legislation, to push certain candidates across the finish line in primaries and sometimes in general elections. I think he can do that in certain states. While I think he will have a huge effect, a tremendous effect on the primary in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, it will have a detrimental one in the general election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.